we're at a point now where there's really not any targeting that you should be doing in channels like Meta or TikTok outside of some geography parameters that fit like where you want to serve. And the reason why this works is because the algorithms, and the rise of AI, like some of the best AI examples and use cases have actually been in these advertising companies like Meta, companies like Google. I mean, it is amazing how good their algorithms have been and are today.
Ryan, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So you had at one point an agency called Unique Influence that you ended up selling and moving on from. You sold to MDC.
Yep, that's right.
And through working there and running that company, but then also just in being a digital marketer for years, work with major brands like E-Trade, Fox. Talk about like what was one of the most significant lessons you learned about media buying and the impact of creative and how those two things coexist?
Sure. Well, when I first started Unique Influence, we were, working with brands that were more like Zynga or other brands like Beachbody, which I don't know if you're familiar with P90X and others. And with those brands, we quickly realized that creative performance was incredibly important, especially when it comes to driving performance on channels like social media channels, in particular Meta. And so I think one of the most significant lessons was, if the creative isn't very good for this type of advertising, really no amount of media buying optimization work is going to drive performance at all. And so as a result, what we realized is that we needed to launch a creative arm inside the agency to be able to support this.
So you started as media only, realized, hey, we're good at media, but we got a great creative to make the results happen.
That's exactly right.
And so you added that as a service. Okay.
That's exactly right. But it was definitely about the simplest version of that is, you could do, right? Because it was really trying to do it cost effectively and without the full chops of a creative agency. And sometimes we would take people's existing creative and chop it up. But a lot of it was actually our own kind of lo-fi style, influencer style creative that worked fine. But after the acquisition, that's where we realized just how important creative actually was. Like speaking of brands like Fox and E-Trade, where we were working with some fantastic creative agencies in our portfolio, and among the variety of brands that I ended up working with while running digital performance at Assembly, which was the largest media buying agency inside of MDC. The creative agencies like 72 and Sunny and others, like they produce this creative, probably similar to what y'all are familiar with in terms of creative production. And, that level of creative really did an amazing job in terms of driving performance in a way that even with our kind of own kludgy attempts while we were independent, we really couldn't pull off.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Given that your background is in media, so how do you, obviously, but you also worked a lot with creative. Well, how do you judge if creative is good?
Yeah, definitely. Well, when the purpose of the creative is to drive performance, then it's pretty straightforward because you're looking at the metrics of success. And the reality is that you definitely want to look at platform level metrics. Like, for example, what is Meta saying or what is Google saying? Or if you're running advertising like OTT, over the top, effectively digital video advertising that's delivered at home. The measurement of that matters. And you look at whether or not that creative drove people to your website, whether or not that led to conversions. It's more complicated to measure when you're talking about CPG brands or other companies where the product is purchased not digitally. But there are ways to measure, right? I mean, you can certainly measure all the way down. So, connecting the performance of the individual piece of creative all the way through to, how it actually did to drive sales, or, in the case of like, let's call it Fox, like driving box office sales, things like that, it actually can be directionally measured and also directly measured in many cases, like, for example, when you're talking about social. So, I mean, what you're ultimately trying to do is to work through a lot of different creatives, searching for the one that works, that drives performance.
Yeah. Okay. And understanding the difference between demand creation and demand capture is a crucial differentiation. And how does understanding the difference between those strategies impact a brand's media mix?
It's interesting. So I'm going to first talk about them individually, and then we'll talk about them in a combined way. So I always say that, if you're a company where people are searching for what you do in mass, they're going to Google. There's a lot of people out there searching. That's a pretty straightforward business to build.
Like an example would be what?
Well, an example would be like at Zen Business, this company that I helped start, where people are searching to form an LLC. It's a very obvious search, right?
Yeah.
And so for a brand like that, it's pretty straightforward to get an ad in front of the right person at the right time, right? And so that, in terms of demand capture, there are channels that are exceptionally good at that. An example of that could be Amazon. Amazon does a very good job in terms of e-commerce of capturing demand, and also same thing with Google. So the reality is, though, that many brands, many companies, they don't have that built-in demand. They have to create that demand. And you talked a little bit about demand creation. And that's where more mid to upper funnel channels will start to come in. And that's when we were talking earlier about social and TV and even podcasts and other forms of media that are building awareness about the product. And so that's really the difference. Now, the problem with thinking about them in separated ways is that as a marketer, with the responsibility of driving revenue for the company, which at the end of the day, that's what the marketer ultimately is responsible for at the most senior level, you're going to be inclined to want to cut channels that look like they're not necessarily working very well. And those channels tend to look like those demand creation channels. By definition, it's more expensive to drive people from, unaware to aware, and then to actually, plant that thought in their head. So the next time they think about whatever it is that you provide as a service or the product that you offer, that they go, oh yeah, this brand, I remember that brand. Let's actually go in and search for it. The reality is this is where measurement of media mix modeling comes in. And we worked on this with, I'm thinking back to E-Trade as a client, where we had this fantastic media mix model. And it really showed us in detail what was going on across all of the different channels. We could see, what's happening in TV and what's happening in search and, what's happening in social media advertising and what were their relative contributions, these fractional attribution to the person that actually took an action and converted on the website. So as a result, what you start to realize is that these channels, they all play a role in getting the person from unaware to aware to actually considering to getting to the point where they're actually converting. And they work together with one another. There's a certain amount of, and the last thing I'll say on this is there's a certain amount of demand capture that you as a brand can do. And that's really your easiest, most cost-effective conversions. They're going to come from there. But you're going to cap out at that at some point. You're going to hit a point where there's just no more people at that price. You're competing with all of these other brands who are also competing for that. There's just a limited number of people doing that in terms of that search behavior. And so as a result of that, it really does become important to figure out the demand creation piece of things, because that's really once you're trying to grow a brand and establish yourself in a differentiated way against your competitors and really create a premiumness feel to who you are, that can really only be done through that higher fidelity video that somebody is going to ultimately consume in those demand creation type channels.
Yeah. So what is the secret to that? And there's probably no secret, but it's a lot of just testing channels, proving it out. But what we often see is you can lower the cost per acquisition if you have a really smart full funnel campaign and do more targeted awareness at the top part of the funnel. You can lower that cost per acquisition down below. So I'm sure you saw that a lot too, right? And was able to prove out that model.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah. So investing more in the mid to upper funnel activity. You may not say, I know exactly which channels are having the most impact, but you would know from the mix that overall you're having impact.
Yeah. And what I would say, what's really neat about a really well-run media mix model is you can know which channel is driving value. And I think that that's where it's critical as the marketer. I think it's your responsibility to know fractionally how each of those channels are contributing to driving conversions. The way that media mix models work, it's very simple. So what they do is they say, okay, let's say I want to run TV. It's a new channel. Great. All right, I'm going to take the entire country. Most of it's going to be dark, but I'm going to take these 10, mid-sized cities. You're going to want cities of different sizes, some small, some medium, some large. And, I'm going to show like enough saturation of TV advertising to people in these demos and in these geos, rather, in these different DMAs. So as a result of that, you're saying, okay, look, these 10 cities, people there, they saw like a good percentage of people saw my TV ad. And then you just look at conversions overall in the city. And this works for CPG. It works for any type of brand. You could be selling physical goods in Walmart. Like you can tell, like, did it move sales in the Walmarts in those 10 cities, right? And so you start to get a sense. If you're running these on an ongoing basis across all of your channels, across different cities and different combinations, then you can pretty accurately measure.
With the rise of like platforms like Meta and TikTok, the standard for creative quality has really changed. So it's really shifted. How has this changed how marketers really think about targeting and, I guess, engagement in general?
This is very cliche sounding, and you hear it from Meta all the time. And the thing that they'll say, and the thing that I'll say here, is that creative is the new targeting. You're calling it a creative first approach. And, I would almost call a creative only approach. The reality is that we're at a point now where there's really not any targeting that you should be doing in channels like Meta or TikTok outside of some geography parameters that fit like where you want to serve. So, let's say, for example, you're a brand that sells products to consumers in the United States. Well, your targeting should be the United States. And that's a gigantic target, right? But certainly above a certain age, like maybe you want to go like 18 and up, or maybe you want to go like 18 to 55 or whatever. You just figure out where your sweet spot is. But still, that's a gigantic target.
Yeah.
And the reason why this works is because the algorithms, and the rise of AI, like some of the best AI examples and use cases have actually been in these advertising companies like Meta, companies like Google. I mean, it is amazing how good their algorithms have been and are today. And so as a result of that, you end up getting a piece of creative out and deployed. And the first 100 people, Meta's checking out to see like, okay, how are people engaging with that? Who are those people? What do they look like? Okay, the next 1,000, what's their level of engagement? Who clicked? Who shared? So as a result of all of this behavioral information that they're capturing, they're then saying, okay, this is the group of people that most likes what you have to offer. And what's interesting, and this is why it's so much better than the way that it used to be. It used to be that you would target people based on interests or categories, like, okay, you're a mom, or, you're interested in playing the guitar, whatever it is, But now, because it's so broad, what you can do is you can create different types of creative that are targeted at different people, different demos, different personas. Now, all of a sudden, you're sitting there and saying, okay, well, what are the 6 or so different groups of people that are pretty different from one another? And I'm going to create different creative for each of them. And I know that the type of people that I'm trying to target with this will affiliate with these particular creative based on how I've designed them. And then as a result, you end up with this like targeting that's like embedded because the creative really resonated with a particular group of people.
So let different creative be the bait on the hook, let the algorithm decide, and then go chase that.
And that's absolutely how it works. Like you're not going to fight that. It doesn't really matter what you try to do. That is how it works. And TikTok also introduced the same thing. So, it wasn't like that before. I would say up until about mid-year last year, it was more kind of interest and targeting based. But, now it's transitioned similar to Meta to be much more aligned with this broader targeting and, letting the creative do the hard work. I guess the last thing I'll say, sometimes people get concerned about sharing data with these platforms. And I get it. For some like exceptionally large brands like we would work with, I get why they're not willing to share their data. There's nothing I can do about that, but you're at a very big advantage if you're willing to share that data because, Meta will actually take a look and they'll say, okay, certain number of people clicked on the ad. There's a certain number of people that actually made it to the site and actually engaged with it and made it through the conversion funnel experience and stayed on the site for this amount of time. And yes, ultimately took your conversion action. Those are all signals that go into the platform. Same thing with Google. And, as a result, you can really hit some performance metrics as a result. It requires a lot of creative to do what I'm talking about. You know, I think people completely underestimate the volume of creative. I would say that probably 10% or so of your budget should be allocated to creative production. And, you know, for a brand of any magnitude, I mean, I'm talking about like hundreds of pieces of new creative a month. And that's alarmingly high, I bet, for most people. But the randomness of it all, it's so hard. I mean, of course, like you're going to have the same piece of creative with, you know, 4 different hooks, and that's 4 pieces of creative. And that didn't take very long because the hooks just were very easy to create. But, you know, the point is it's like just a randomness game in a way. And then you look at this piece of creative, this particular, you know, influencer or this particular concept, and you're like, wow, this is blown out of the park. I don't know why, but, you know, it's working great. And so, you know, that's why it's a numbers game in terms of the production that's necessary to drive the performance.
So some of this answer to the next question I'm going to ask you is embedded in what you said, but I'd love to hear directly how you would answer the question. What common misconceptions or pitfalls do you see people have when it comes to measuring incremental impact across channels?
Well, I sure see a lot.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that this is probably, I think there are just some common pitfalls that marketers fall into generally. And part of that is, well, there's so many, I don't even know that I want to enumerate, but I'll focus in on what you're talking about, which is measurement. One thing that's really changed over time is a form of measuring that is called MTA. It's a style of measurement that is focused on cookies and the use of that data to do measurement. There were a lot of changes. iOS led the change really in terms of pulling out a lot of that data that, you know, companies could use for tracking purposes. There are a few companies who have a pretty complete view of you, but those are the companies that really like you're always logged into. So those examples are like an Amazon, a Meta, a Google, like, you know, those types of brands, because they see you everywhere you go, because these pixels are all over the place and you're logged in, you know, they have a really good picture of who you are and they don't need the cookie to do that. But, you know, as you get outside of that into any of these experimental channels, it's very difficult to measure. So, you know, we are at a point where if you're going to do this, the very bottom of the funnel channels that are click-based only and are focused in on these few top channels, you can get away with standard measurement. You definitely want to have an attribution model where you're giving fractional attribution to the different channels, because one pitfall you can run into is that you may, let's say you have a campaign running on Meta, it's created this awareness, somebody clicks through, you know, they don't convert, but 2 days later they search for your brand. They never knew about your brand, but they found out it because of this Meta ad. And then they click on it. And then all of a sudden they go in and they convert. Now, if you give that entire credit to Google, it's called last click attribution, well, that's not really fair because Meta actually did most of the hard work. You know, actually Google did very little work in that example. And, you know, there is the ability to at least minimally do this. But channels like Meta will, by default, include conversion data that comes from view-throughs. So a view-through is I saw the ad and I later went to the website and I converted on my own. And as long as that happens in a window, let's call it 24 hours, well, I'm going to take credit for that. I'm going to say that I drove that conversion. And for large brands in particular, this is very dangerous because these large brands, this wasn't such a big problem when I was working on brands that were smaller, but as a large brand, you know, the percentage likelihood that somebody who is in market for what you do and coming to your site just on their own is actually pretty high because they know who you are. So you're part of the consideration set. So they're coming to you. And so what's problematic is when marketers take a look at the advertising results in Meta and they say, oh, well, this particular piece of creative or this campaign did fantastically. And they start showing the results to everybody and asking for more budget. And, you know, it could be based on the view through attribution results, which, you know, really are not truly incremental. And when I say incremental, I mean, they aren't conversions that happened as a result of the actual advertising. So what I tend to do is I tend to encourage people to look at click-based attribution, to just ignore the view-throughs. There's credit to those, like certainly they're driving value. But if you can make the campaign work just on click-based attribution alone, maybe do a 7-day window, then, at least minimally, you're likely driving really good performance. I think that covers a few things that are major pitfalls.
So in your experience, like working lower funnel and moving up the funnel in terms of building out the creative assets that are needed to do the full funnel approach, you mentioned a minute ago about the quantity that is needed.
Yeah.
How do you keep the bar high when there's a certain brand standard, right? But you do need a huge amount of creative in order to test and figure out what to chase.
It's a very good question. I mean, I think that it depends on what size brand you are.
Yeah.
If you're a very large brand with a top tier creative agency, they will own a vast majority of how creative gets produced. The creative agency will. And obviously there's sign off with the marketer and, they're intimately involved in the whole thing. But, I would say that the creative agency engagements that I've seen that work the best, they absolutely have a seat at the table with every creative conversation that's happening. Producing large volume of creative for those large brands is more challenging. They are definitely holding to a brand standard, and potentially, the marketer may be fairly hamstrung in terms of the range of creative that they can produce. The reality is, though, that as a large brand, your creative does work that much better. And so doing cuts of what might be your TV commercial or getting, a dozen or so influencers that are relevant to your brand to create some lo-fi content that you can cut up into different segments with a bunch of different hooks like we talked about earlier. Those are ways to make that sort of large scale production work for a larger brand while maintaining brand standards. If you're more of a mid-sized brand, or even more importantly, an emerging brand, then certainly you're going to have brand standards, but it won't have the type of controls that exist when you're a much larger brand. And as a result of that, there is a much larger range of options of
it's actually liberating,
production.
isn't it?
That's right. And there's more creative production options. You can work with now, instead of a half dozen or a dozen very curated influencers where, you're micromanaging everything they say, you could work with 100 different people and, figure out what works for your brand. You could hire a few different, small little creative production shops that are focused in on just this one particular type of creative. So ultimately, what I would say is that, people move into this need for large-scale creative production when they realize that there's just not enough demand at the bottom of the funnel. The demand capture isn't sufficient to drive the needs of the business. And so as they move upper funnel, they're going to start with what's easiest. They're going to create a few pieces of creative. Hopefully it's high quality. Hopefully it really works. For some brands, that's enough. I'll tell you, we worked on, for example, at Fox, every time they would come out with a new movie, there's this incredible trailer. You do different cuts of the trailer, of course, but you don't need a bunch of creative. I remember when Deadpool came on the scene and we were promoting that, and it was people were crazy about that movie before it came out. People loved it. And you didn't need a bunch of creative for that. So for brands that are constantly coming out with something new, another good example, we worked on Chanel. So Chanel had these fantastic articles of clothing and handbags and other things that people loved. Every time we would take a lifestyle photo or even a picture of a product, put that in front of people, people loved it. That was actually pretty easy, right?
Yeah.
It's because there's something new and exciting to show people all the time. It gets much harder when you have one thing to talk about. When you're a brand that provides one service, you have one product. That's where you need a lot of quantity, because it's how many times can you say the same thing, right? And not make the person who's seeing your creative man, I saw that already. That's kind of boring.
Yeah.
I think about insurance commercials when this comes to mind. It's they're trying to be creative. They're coming up with fun ways to say exactly the same thing for, 20 years in a row.
That's right.
Switching gears a little bit, as somebody with a mission-driven approach to life and business, and especially now even in the trading education space. I'm curious how you incorporate empathy and purpose into strategies that are typically more performance driven, focused on performance metrics.
Yeah, definitely. I will say that, I don't know, maybe it's just getting older, maybe having a family. I have this beautiful wife and 2 young kids, 2 young boys that are amazing. And that definitely changed my perspective on what's important. I mean, when I was running that agency, Unique Influence, and then once it became acquired and I was involved with all those big brands, I mean, I think over that time, I worked with maybe 200 different companies. And the reality is I realized okay, I could do all sorts of different things. That's great. I want to do work that inspires me and I want to do good in the world because that keeps me motivated. Then it doesn't become about, okay, is the business doing well and are we meeting our financial goals or hopefully exceeding them? And, how's this project going? And, if at the end of the day, I can remember the person for whom this company exists, then I can personally be motivated. I remember with Zen Business, Public Benefit Corporation, really trying to do good in the world. And we were focused on helping people who really probably had never started a business before. 87% of people who started new business have never started one in the past. So these are people that by and large, have never done this before. And they're going out to create a new business to create a better life for themselves. And that was very inspiring for me. So I thought, okay, that is something I can get behind. And so then that makes the work, that more enjoyable. In terms of, how you connect that to performance metrics, for me, it's more about the companies that I decide to work on. And, are they doing good in the world more fundamentally? If you're providing a really good product or service that's actually helping people, that's where the hard part comes in. It's not actually the advertising or the marketing. And as a result of that, the performance comes when the actual product itself works or the service itself works, that people go in and they review you and they talk positively about you and they share it with their friends. That word of mouth, that credibility that's gained only by providing something of true value comes in that way. You talked about trading. So I oversee growth at a company called Ninja Trader. I oversee growth there. And what's really neat about that role is I'm ultimately working to help traders become better at their trading. I've traded for about 15 years myself. For the first 10 of those years, it was a big struggle. It's incredibly difficult. And so as a result, I have an immense amount of empathy for the trader who's trying to figure it out for the first time. And to me, that's the mission. So what's the mission? Okay, people are looking to make their lives better. It's the same common thread with Zen Business. People are trying to make their lives better financially through this particular means. The Zen Business was starting a new business. Trading is a form of trying to also generate money in a different way through the markets. And so that mission drives me every day to do good work. And then the question becomes, how does that drive performance? At the end of the day, if what you're really trying to do is to help a person accomplish their goals and you really care about them, I really actually care about these people who are trying to figure it out. I really truly think about the struggle that they go through and how can I maximize the chance that this person who's coming in, giving this a shot, will have a good experience and stick around and be happy and make money, right? It's them against the big institutions, right? So I really want them to win. And so we're creating this clear pathway to help them do that. And that pathway of learning how to become a better trader, that experience that we create for them, that will have performance benefits for our brain too. More people will stick around and be successful. More people will tell their friends about the success that they're having. So I fundamentally believe, and I go back to the point I made earlier, that, if you're providing value with your product or your service, and that's getting people to stick around and getting them to tell their friends, that's what creates value. And that's what actually drives performance at the same time.
I love that. I think it's such a really good lesson for any brand. What you're doing is, you're educating people that are trying to level up in life. But I think any brand can take something from that and be like, you've always got to be adding value. Whether that's the actual product or whether that's the community that you build or the education you provide or whatever that is, right?
That's right.
So, powerful. Thank you. Great conversation. Appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, fantastic. I appreciate it.
Yeah.